Hi, good afternoon, HKIN 231 students. I'm going to lecture today on children and sports psychology. So I wanted to do a little bit of a review of what we covered last class and just get you up to date on some of the things that we talked about around the key issues around working with youth in sports psychology and some of the main reasons why we as sports psychologists or mental performance specialists spend time investigating and finding out the different sort of patterns of sport performance and why children participate in sport and why they drop out. So we're going to look at the importance of sport and exercise psychology. We'll talk about the psychology of a young athlete, the kind of things that they're dealing with and what kinds of things they're thinking about when they think about their own sport performance. We'll talk about why children participate in sport and why they withdraw from sport, and a little bit of a review from last class on that. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the concept of stress and burnout in children's athletics, and so how competitive sport can induce a situation or a state where the athlete does feel some stress and has to find ways to be able to manage that. And we're also going to talk about effective coaching practices in sport and what kinds of things we can do as sport and exercise psychologists or people in the coaching and teaching field to help athletes be able to respond a little bit better and be able to manage their sporting environment and to encourage active sport participation. So what we do know is that there definitely are some important implications for sports psychology in the sporting world. When we look at the stats as far as the amount of children involved in sport, we know that it's really high. In Canada, we currently have at least 30 million people participating in some level of sport, whether it be grassroots level or elite athletics. And that has just continued to grow because of the advent of Olympic Games being held in Canada and just the interest from the government as far as funding. So what we do know as far as development is that we see, as we mentioned last class, we talked about last class, is participation in sport usually peaks at about the age of 10 to 12, sort of the golden age of learning. And this age of learning obviously is where there's a lot of other motor development things going on for a child. So not only are they psychologically trying to balance themselves and find ways to be able to manage their sporting environment, especially more competitive sporting environments, but they're also dealing with coordination, pattern, movement issues with the body growing. So although we do realize that this is the golden age of learning, that also shifts and gets adjusted depending on the kind of activity that somebody's doing. So if they're in gymnastics, we might see earlier participation and earlier peaking. So when we talk about the idea of organized sport again, one of the things I think we have to remember is why children actually participate in sport. And this is what we kind of talked about a little bit last class as parents losing sight of this idea that children are there to have fun, socialize. So they want to make new friends, they want to develop skills, they want to get exercise, and they just want to be really involved. And so they really have similar motives, both boys and girls, when it comes to sport participation. And I think that's something we really need to keep in mind. When we talk about children discontinuing participation in sport, the statistics say that peak participation occurs between the ages of 10 and 13 years old. For every 10 children who begin a sports season, 3 to 4 quit before the start of the next season. We talked about withdrawal last class and some of the reasons for it. Sometimes athletes have other things to do. They may get involved in music or art or some other, just even kind of building social skills in other environments. So again, that can be a reason, but other times it could be a really bad situation with peers or with coaches that cause athletes to withdraw. So we talk about this idea of pressure as well. Usually sometimes the competitive environment creates a much more pressured environment than the athlete is prepared to deal with. And when they're, again, developing, going through sort of the psychological balancing and just of emotions, just to start off with in adolescence, that can be very challenging to have that extra pressure on top. So we know again that the stress in the athlete can be a problem. The idea of perceived competence also is a big problem, as we talked about last class, when we talk about building confidence and keeping someone active and involved and feeling like they have some way to build their self-efficacy and their self-esteem and they're capable of doing something. So children will drop out of sport because they're comparing themselves to other teammates who are spending hours on end throughout the week training in high performance environments, and sometimes kids just feel like they can't keep up. So we do see the participation rates drop as the sporting environment becomes more competitive. So when we look at figure 22.1, again, that one does have the explanation of all of the different reasons. So you can see, again, the underlying psychological motive that we can relate to at some level, this idea of perceived competence, goal orientation, and stress response. So we did look at that last class. We also looked at the fact of general dropouts, the idea that those are the big concern dropouts, because if an athlete switches from one sport to another, it may just mean that they didn't have a personality match with that sport. It's the general dropouts where they just drop out of sport altogether that we can be particularly concerned with, just because, again, what's happened in that sporting environment that's caused someone to actually just completely move away from the sporting world. So when we start looking at that, we would sort of question, what sort of experience did those athletes have? Sometimes very negative ones, depending on the environment and how competitive it is, and just the inability to be able to develop the coping mechanisms that are necessary to be able to perform at the levels that are required or expected of them for the more elite athletics. So why children discontinue sport is, again, the withdrawal is most children are there to have fun and to enjoy the social environment, and so the motive to win is sort of really in the back. They're there just really to engage as a team and support one another, and when it becomes too competitive, some kids just really don't want to be involved in that kind of competitive environment. So when we talk about, again, this idea of discontinuing the sport, that's one of the reasons we really have to kind of keep in the forefront of our mind that not everybody is designed that way, and sometimes it may take a little longer developmentally, psychologically, to be able to manage environments like that. So when we talk participation, most athletes have multiple reasons for participating, and usually the withdrawal for an athlete is they discontinue for those negative reasons, for the pressure, as I mentioned before. So you can see, again, there are different techniques that coaches can use to enhance motivation of an athlete, to meet the specific needs of the environment and to make sure that the athlete feels comfortable, designing skills and real task orientation where the athlete can manage the task that the coach gives, as we've talked about previously in class. So ensuring that they have this sort of flow state, they get to a flow state where they can balance the challenge and their skill ability. So it's really important for the coach to use those kinds of strategies and structure the environment that way, so athletes feel like they're building their self-confidence. So that self-confidence is a really big part of an athlete enjoying the experience. They feel like they can actually try something and they can do it, and they really want to keep moving toward developing their skills. So the keys are sort of development, and when the athlete knows that they're actually able to do something, there's that really good feeling that comes with that. So when we facilitate that motivation, again, one sort of thing we have to kind of think about is why children are discontinuing. We have to look at, is the child interested in another sport? Is withdrawal permanent or temporary? Did the child have a say in the decision? So it was the parent who said, well, I don't want you to play a sport because you're playing another one as well. So we really need to look at sort of what those long-term effects are of the individual. We talk about sport withdrawal and whether or not it's going to have an impact on how they develop psychologically, mentally, socially, and those kinds of things. So we just want to ensure that if their sporting experience was negative and they felt the pressure, that we're able to find a way to help them to cope so that they don't feel like every situation is too hard to manage. So when we talk about this idea of positive roles in friends, there's definitely this support for social support that comes with being friends with their peers on their team, and so that's a really big part, I think, the companionship, the building of self-esteem, and just knowing that they get along and they fit in and they enjoy playing their sport and being around their friends. So we're sort of always kind of keep that at the forefront of our mind, that that's the reason why kids want to play, is to be social and have fun. So there's this idea, again, of ensuring that the kids are creating a positive role model, being positive role models for one another, and learning ways to manage conflict and coming up with solutions and building those close friendships, and just being able to interact at a level that is acceptable for their sport, and then also meet the expectations that the coach has for the individuals. So again, the sporting, I'm moving past this part of the lecture because we're not really necessarily focusing on this area. But what I'm going to go to is I'm going to go now to stress and burnout in children's competitive sport. So we did talk about the issues around pressure and increased anxiety. In last class we looked at injury in sport. And so I just wanted to sort of address the key issues around stress and burnout. And in athletes, high stress and state anxiety levels are relatively rare, which might sound kind of surprising, but when we talk state anxiety, again, we usually see children's studies. There haven't been a lot of really intense controlled studies that look at state anxiety. So we measure trait anxiety through scales looking at personality, so dispositions, but we don't always use state anxious trait in a sport environment with youth. So this may be one of the reasons why the numbers look so low. But when we look at specific situations and we start looking at various sport environments, we do see pockets of it. So when we look at the effect, over 2.5 million children in specific situations have some state anxiety. So stress among elite junior competitors is caused by that sort of fear of failure, fear of inadequacy, again, that comparing themselves to their peers, which again, in cases puts the athlete at risk of having low self-esteem and feeling incompetent. So we really have to sort of look at that state anxiety and look at why they're feeling that way, and look at if there's a way that we could reduce that as a coach or a trainer or somebody who's involved with the athletes to ensure the athlete feels that they're getting an acceptable level of attention to be able to develop skill and minimize the state anxiety. Excessive trait anxiety does not appear to be associated with youth sport participation. So again, there's nothing to be said that that person might not come in being a highly trait anxious individual, and then it's heightened with state anxiety. But again, not a lot of research has been done looking specifically at looking at sort of keying to see whether or not somebody comes in before as a trait anxious individual. So it's hard to really look at saying that it's the sport that causes trait anxiety. So when we talk about stress and burnout, what we do know is that children who do come with high trait anxiety or have had some testing done previously that shows that they are highly trait anxious, their parents are very aware of that, they're usually at heightened risk for state anxiety because of that sort of elevating factor. So put them into a high pressure situation, they already have trait anxiety, so they're already anxious about trying to be able to carry out a certain task. And for decision making, and then we add that element of pressure to it, and then the state anxiety increases the trait anxiety, so it heightens the response. So those athletes that are at risk for burnout are those athletes that are high in trait anxiety coming into the sport, and usually those with low self-esteem or maladaptive perfectionism, so where everything has to be exacting, and there's no flexibility in the way that they can respond to certain environments and how certain coaches will treat them and those sorts of things. So the other thing is low performance expectancies relative to the team, so they may not have the same idea of what they want to do in the sport. So that's a really big piece of it as well. So we have to keep that in mind when we talk about this idea of heightened anxiety. So frequent worries about failure, so always thinking that they're not going to be able to do something can be quite worrisome for the athlete, again, increasing their state anxiety. And again, if they don't have a supportive coach or someone's going to kind of encourage them, and if the parents on top of that aren't encouraging them, that can really kind of build on really kind of affecting their self-esteem. So when we talk again, this sort of frequent worries again about adult expectations, the adults are expecting one thing, child's expecting something different. Coach also has high expectations, but the child's just not really there and ready to kind of put in that kind of effort. That can create a lot of stress for the child. And this idea that it's just not fun, like they have to show up and work hard and there's no fun, there's no reward at the end for it. So again, when we talk about performance, if the focus also is on winning too much, the athlete can feel frustrated if there's a lot of loss, feeling like they have no control over the outcome. So when we talk perception and risks and the heightened state anxiety, the participation is important to parents. Can also, if it's too important, it can also create state anxiety because the athlete feels like they have to meet the expectations of the parents, which sometimes aren't realistic because of the environment. So the coach may not be spending the time that's needed with the athlete, they're not getting extra training to be able to keep up with some of the athletes that are receiving it. And as well an outcome goal orientation. So if it's all focused on winning, scoring goals, those sorts of things, then it's going to affect their perceived ability, because if they come out not scoring, they're going to feel like, wow, I didn't do what I was supposed to do. And when the reality is, we know that the idea of that environment is to create an environment that's fun and social. So essentially they did do what they were supposed to do, but when we talk developmentally skill, their skill level is not improving. So that again can create some stress for the athlete. So different situational sources of stress would be things like the defeat versus victory, the event importance. So if it's a high pressure situation, a tournament or a championship game. The sport type also might put some more pressure on an athlete if it's an individual sport like swimming or something like that. So burnout is definitely a part of the sport environment. We do know that some athletes will discontinue sport and involvement because of chronic stress. So it's something to be really aware of and pay particularly close attention to when we look at what burnout is and what the athlete is feeling. A lot of the time, the athlete feels like they have really little say in what it is that they're going to do. So the parents just decide they're playing their sport. They have the expectations for them. The coach has high expectations. And the child has no ability to be able to express what they're feeling. And again, this can lead to them really closing themselves off. And then that becomes internalized, and it's very difficult for them to be able to feel supported. And so if the environment's not fun, if they're not making friends and they're showing up and they're not developing that sense of perceived competence and self-efficacy, then of course you're going to see the child feeling very stressed out and very, very upset. So all of these factors play in, and this slide really just talks about those factors that we've looked at. Again, looking at coaching practices, long practices and big expectations, high level of skating. If it's hockey, let's say, for example, or soccer where there's lots of running, or just sports where swimming where it's individual and they have to just do laps over and over and over again, and they kind of feel like they're not getting anywhere. It can be a real problem. So these are kind of the main ideas. Then when we look at the factors, and you could just continue to look at the list that is there, look at things like traveling a lot, and all the things you can imagine, again, that comes with the sporting world. Overuse injuries as well, so an athlete might be injured and they just don't have the opportunity to be able to heal from that injury, and they go back into their sport again, and they're feeling like they can't put as much effort in, and so the coach is frustrated, and sometimes it's just when we talk about sport injury, it's just that recognizing that they may be in a burnout situation and pulling the athlete out to be able to heal and to be able to recover from their injury properly before they actually return to their sport, and parents acknowledging that, the coaches acknowledging that, without getting too caught up in the expectations. Perfectionism obviously is another thing that can be a real problem, because if the athlete has sort of this high self-expectation and they're not meeting those expectations, they may come out never celebrating the things that they've done well because they're always expecting a little bit more. So again, when we talk about the practical implications of all of this, it's going to be really important to help athletes develop the confidence and the ability to be able to manage mistakes. We do have physical strategies that we can use, for example, a stress bag to put worries in. I know some of our athletes, we talk to them about like when they shower, just showering it all away, and so letting go of all the stress when they have that shower. That strategy can be really effective. Fun strategies like jelly belly or spaghetti toes or relaxation strategies, so it gets them just to kind of let their body loosen up a little bit and feel like, okay, it's fun, it's okay to just be loose, and we don't have to be tense and tight and worried. And so again, to help them with some of the managing to be able to channel their emotions. So changing channels is another thing. That idea of focusing and refocusing. So the street light analogy that I used previously. So teaching them to turn it on and turn it off, to be able to get themselves back to a place of green, so where they feel that flow state. So switching it on when they don't need to be focused, and then turning it back. Turning it off and then turning it on. So turning it on when they do need to be focused. Okay, so again, some of these practical implications we've talked about previously, but I think most importantly, what we take from this is that the children's environment should be fun. It should be engaging, it should be social, it should allow them time for breaks, it should allow them to talk about what kind of things they've done to develop as an athlete.